1,600 earthquakes in 2 days under one of the most popular vacation islands in Europe. And the official alert level hasn't moved an inch. That's what's happening right now beneath Tenerife, and it's reignited a genuinely heated argument between residents, scientists, and the agencies responsible for warning the public if something serious is building underneath Mount Teide. Millions of tourists are on that island right now, most with absolutely no idea any of this is happening, lying on a beach or hiking through the national park, just a short drive from a seismometer that's been logging tremors nearly nonstop for days. Here's exactly what the data shows, what scientists think is causing it, why so many people on the island feel like they're not getting the full picture, and what history on this exact island tells us about how seriously to take it. Starting on the night of July 22nd, Spain's National Geographic Institute, known as the IGN, recorded a dramatic spike in seismic activity beneath the western part of Las Cañadas del Teide, the massive volcanic crater that dominates the center of Tenerife. Automatic processing detected roughly 1,600 separate earthquakes in just 2 days, with manual review confirming a few hundred of the strongest events. A separate report a few days into the swarm put the confirmed total closer to 750 events, concentrated beneath the municipalities of Guia de Sora, Villaflor de Chasna, and Santiago del Teide at day PTHS, ranging from 10 to 15 kilometers underground. The strongest quakes recorded during the swarm topped out at a modest magnitude of around 1.6, far too small for anyone standing on the surface to actually feel. Monitoring officials noted that events were arriving in rapid succession, sometimes every 30 to 60 seconds during the most intense stretches. This isn't an isolated event. The Canary Islands Volcanological Institute, known as InVolcan, has now logged this as one of more than a dozen distinct hybrid event swarms recorded beneath Tenerife since October of 2016, with earlier episodes showing up in 2019-2022, twice in 2024 and D2025, and several separate pulses just this past February, some of which individually produced well over 1,000 detected microquakes within a few hours. Taken together, InVolcan has described the broader pattern building since 2016 as the largest sustained stretch of volcanic unrest recorded on the island in recent memory, a slow, persistent hum of activity rather than a single dramatic event. So, what exactly is a hybrid earthquake, and why do scientists keep using that specific word instead of just calling these ordinary tremors? A normal earthquake happens when rock physically cracks and shifts, releasing energy in a sudden, sharp burst. The kind of signal a seismometer records is a clean, sharp spike. A hybrid event is different. It combines that same rock fracturing signal with a second, slower vibration pattern that scientists associate with fluid movement underground. Things like hot water, dissolved gas, or, in more serious cases, actual magma pushing its way through cracks and fissures deep below the surface. There's also a related kete. Gory researchers watch for called long-period events. Slower, smoother signals almost entirely free of the sharp cracking signature, which tend to show up specifically when fluid alone is doing most of the work rather than rock breaking apart. Detecting a hybrid signal doesn't automatically mean magma is on the move, but it does tell researchers that something more complex than simple rock stress is happening down there. Some kind of fluid is shifting around inside the volcanic plumbing beneath the island, interacting with rock in a way that produces this particular mixed signature on the instruments. Scientists at volcano observatories around He World, from Hawaii to Iceland to Italy, watch for exactly this kind of hybrid signal because, historically, it has shown up in the lead-up to genuine eruptions elsewhere, even though its presence alone is nowhere near enough on its own to reliably predict one. According to InVolcan, the leading explanation for this entire decade-long pattern of unrest is what they call the injection of magmatic fluids into Tenerife's hydrothermal system. In plain terms, hot gas and fluid with a magmatic origin appears to be working its way upward, from deep storage and interacting with the island's existing underground water system, raising pressure and occasionally cracking rock as it goes, without necessarily meaning that molten magma itself is anywhere near the surface. Picture it a little like a pressure cooker sitting on a stove, where the heat source deep underground keeps sending hot gas and fluid upward into a partially sealed system. And every so often that rising pressure finds a weak point and cracks or shifts the surrounding rock just slightly, producing exactly the kind of hybrid signal these seismometers keep detecting. Scientists point to a couple of independent pieces of evidence supporting this theory beyond just the earthquakes themselves. Diffuse carbon dioxide emissions measured at Teide's summit crater have been elevated compared to levels recorded a decade ago, and slight ground deformation has been detected since 2024 SPE, specifically in the northeastern sector of the wider Teide Pico Viejo volcanic complex. Both signs are consistent with pressure slowly building somewhere beneath the surface. And Vulcan has been explicit that this underlying process remains active, and shows no sign of easing off, even as they maintain that the odds of an actual eruption in the short or medium term have not meaningfully increased. Researchers elsewhere studying similar hydrothermal systems have documented comparable long-period and hybrid signals tied specifically to fluid movement through cracked rock rather than brittle rock failure alone, reinforcing that this fluid-driven explanation is a genuinely well-established pattern in volcanology generally, not some novel or uniquely suspicious behavior specific to Tenerife. Now here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated and where a real public disagreement has been playing out. Not everyone on the island feels confident that the full picture is actually being communicated clearly. Local commentators and residents following the seismic data closely have pointed out a real discrepancy between the total number of earthquakes different agencies say they've detected using automatic processing and the much smaller number that actually gets manually confirmed and plotted as visible points on the public earthquake maps. That gap exists for a real technical reason: automatic detection system and property. Big grass is burning across a remote high desert rangeland with very few structures directly in its path, so every single morning in the national coordination meetings that decide where crews go, it loses out to fires burning closer to homes and towns. On its own, that's the correct call. Nobody wants scarce crews pulled away from a fire bearing down on someone's house so they can be sent to open rangeland instead. But the side effect nobody designed for is exactly what's happening in eastern Oregon right now. Fires that threaten mostly open ground get left to burn largely unattended, which means they grow to an enormous Z, which means that by the time the wind eventually pushes them towards something that actually matters, a ranch, a highway corridor, a small town, they arrive not as a modest, containable blaze, but as a wall of flame stretching across hundreds of square miles. The fire's own official updates already contain that warning, D, describing extreme behavior with uphill runs, wind-driven pushes, and active threats to structures, communication infrastructure, and roads, all recorded in the same reports that list a firefighting force smaller than the staff of a single restaurant. So how does a fire cover more than 400 square miles in roughly 2 days? The answer sits in what's actually burning, and it flips almost everything people assume about wildfire in the Pacific Northwest. Picture a wildfire out here, and most people imagine dense, old-growth forest, towering trees, and a wall of orange climbing into the canopy. The fuel driving the big grass fire is nothing like that. It's brush and grass, some of it barely a couple of feet tall, and that matters more than the size of the vegetation ever could, because how fast a fire spreads through fine, dry fuel like grass depends almost entirely on wind speed and moisture, not on how much total energy is stored in the plants. A stand of mature timber holds a huge amount of potential energy, but it takes real time to dry out and ignite branch by branch. Dried grass sitting at extremely low humidity essentially ignites on contact, and B earns through in seconds with almost no delay. Because there's no delay, the fire stops being limited by the vegetation itself and starts being limited only by the wind. Under sustained gusts in the 15 to 35 mile per hour range, blowing across continuous cured grass sitting at single-digit shio. Humidity? Exactly the kind of weather this region has seen repeatedly this month. A flame front can cover tens of miles in a single afternoon. That's how a fire goes from roughly 50,000 acres to over 200,000 acres between 2 mornings. It's not rare or exotic fire behavior. It's simple physics acting on a type of landscape most people never think of as dangerous. And the forecast isn't offering any relief. Federal fire weather outlooks this week continue to call for widespread, elevated to critical fire conditions across the inland Northwest, the Northern Rockies, and the Northern Great Basin, driven by the same pattern of gusty westerly winds, single-digit to 20% humidity, and triple-digit heat. Isolated dry thunderstorms are also in the forecast, which means new lightning. Used ignitions remain a real possibility even while existing fires are nowhere close to contained. This isn't a single bad weather day the region can absorb and bounce back from. It's the same dangerous pattern returning again and again, hammering an already overstretched region while the crews who would normally respond to brand new fire starts are already tied up elsewhere. Beyond big grass, Oregon alone has close to 100 large fires tracked at any given moment, ranging from smaller blazes under 30,000 acres up through several complexes well past the 6-figure mark. Fires in Wheeler County, Harney County, and Jefferson County have each independently crossed 50,000 to 160,000 acres this season, and containment on several of them still sits in the single digits or low double digits weeks after ignition. What's notable? Leah's, how many of these fires share the same profile as big grass? Remote terrain, light staffing relative to their size, and fuel that's mostly grass and brush rather than timber. That pattern isn't a coincidence. It's the direct result of a state that's simultaneously fighting dozens of large fires, with a national resource pool that's already stretched to its ceiling everywhere else. Zoom out, and the picture across the rest of the Northwest fire list tells the same story in different fires. Several active blazes on national forest land in Oregon and Washington are showing extreme fire behavior, group torching, wind-driven runs, active threats to homes, and some currently have 0 PERS, on ill-assigned. A handful of fires burning inside national park land in Washington show similar patterns, with estimated containment dates pushed all the way out to November, essentially betting that snowfall, not firefighters, will be what finally stops them. Meanwhile, several mid-sized Oregon fires are gaining tens of thousands of acres in a single day, even with Hugh, and dreads of people already assigned, showing that even fires with real staffing are struggling to keep pace with how fast this fuel type burns. Well over 100 structures have already been confirmed destroyed this season, and that number is expected to climb. The strain has grown severe enough that military aircraft have been pulled into the response, converting cargo planes into makeshift air tankers using a roll-on retardant system normally kept in reserve for exactly this kind of situation. That step isn't routine. It only gets triggered once the commercial air tanker contracts the country normally relies on are already fully booked, and the civilian fire system formally asks the Department of Defense for backup. In other words, the country has already run through the aircraft it typically leases for this job and started converting military planes to fill the gap. Zoom out even further, and there's a genuinely uncomfortable detail hiding in the national numbers. Year to date, the country has recorded well over 40,000 individual fires, running noticeably above the 10-year average pace, with total acres burned also sitting above the historical average. But it's not a record-breaking, once-in-a-generation number. It's elevated, certainly running somewhere around a fifth above the typical pace, yet still nowhere near the worst seasons on record. And the country hit the top of its preparedness scale anyway. That gap is the real warning sign. This system didn't buckle under an extreme historic load. It buckled under a load that was only moderately above AV. Hair age, because that load landed concentrated in one region instead of spread out evenly across the country. The entire mutual aid system the national fire response depends on assumes that when one area is overwhelmed, 9 others can send help. That's the exact thing that stopped functioning this year. To understand what a fire like this can do once it actually receives serious resources, look at the Kaiser Canyon fire burning on the Colville Reservation in north-central Washington, close to the small community of Nespelem. It's start D from a lightning strike in mid-July, and, as of the most recent updates, has burned well past 120,000 acres, with containment sitting somewhere between roughly 10 and 15%. Unlike Big Grass, this fire did get real resources behind it, with several hundred personnel, dozens of F-crews and engines, and a dedicated incident management team running the response. Even with all of that support, the fire has still outpaced containment efforts on more than one occasion, at times growing faster than crews could build fire line around it. The human toll on the reservation has been severe. More than 1,000 people were displaced under mandatory evacuation orders, with emergency shelters set up at a local high school. Multiple homes have been confirmed destroyed, along with dozens of additional structures like sheds, hotel bookings, travel insurance calculations, airline schedules, and the broader flow of visitors. The island's economy depends on so heavily that reality doesn't by itself prove anyone is manipulating data for financial reasons. Monitoring agency, as everywhere in the world, have to walk a genuinely difficult line between causing unnecessary panic over a swarm that fizzles out the way most of them historically have on Tenerife, and failing to warn people early enough if conditions were to meaningfully change. It's a version of the same challenge disaster forecasters face, sometimes described as the boy who cried wolf problem, where raising the alarm too often over events that ultimately amount to nothing risks eroding public trust right at the moment a genuinely serious warning eventually needs to be taken seriously. But it's completely understandable why residents living directly on top of an active volcanic system, watching earthquake counts climb into the thousands while the public alert color stays exactly the same, want more transparency about exactly how that specific threshold gets decided, and want a clearer, more detailed public explanation than a single word like green can really provide, especially when their own daily lives and livelihoods are what would actually be disrupted if the situation genuinely changed. There's also a broader conversation happening among some local experts about what volcanic preparedness should actually look like beyond just watching for the moment an eruption might begin. Some geologists on the island have argued publicly that too much public tie-in gets focused narrowly on the earthquake counts and the alert color itself, while comparatively little attention goes toward the practical planning that would actually matter most if conditions ever did escalate. Things like clearly mapped evacuation routes, designated shelters, and a coordinated plan for moving both residents and the roughly 1 million tourists who might be on the island at any given time during peak season without relying entirely on airports and coastal roads that could themselves be affected by an eruption. That argument doesn't require believing anyone is hiding data to be worth taking seriously, since even a low probability, high consequence event like a Tenerife eruption benefits enormously from having those logistical questions worked out well in advance rather than improvised in the middle of an actual crisis. So where does that leave things right now, heading further into peak tourist season? The scientific consensus among the agencies actually monitoring Teide is that this remains part of the same recurring hydrothermal pattern the island has experienced repeatedly for roughly a decade, driven most likely by magmatic fluids and gas working their way up into the island's existing underground water system, rather than a direct sign that molten rock is imminently approaching the surface. The classic historical warning signs that have preceded actual eruptions elsewhere, earthquakes strong enough for residents to physically feel, rapid and significant ground swelling, and a sudden spike in volcanic gas emissions, are consistently described by monitoring officials as absent from the current data, at least so far. At the same time, the sheer scale and persistence of this latest swarm, arriving on top of well over a decade of episodic unrest that keeps showing no sign of fully quieting down, is exactly the kind of pattern that keeps both professional volcanologists and everyday residents watching closely rather than dismissing it outright. Nobody serious is predicting an eruption is imminent based on what the data currently shows, but nobody serious is calling this genuinely nothing either. That particular gap between an alert level that hasn't moved and a seismograph that clearly has is precisely where all of this public frustration keeps coming from. For anyone actually planning a trip to Tenerife in the near future, the honest, evidence-based takeaway right now is that this is very likely another chapter in a pattern the island has lived through repeatedly since 2016 without it turning into an eruption. Not a sign to cancel a vacation, but it's a genuinely useful moment to understand how volcanic monitoring actually works. Why raw earthquake counts and official alert colors don't always tell the exact same story at the exact same moment, and why residents living permanently on top of an active volcanic island have every reason to keep asking pointed questions about exactly how and how quickly they would actually be warned if that pattern ever did finally break in a different direction. Until then, the volcano keeps quietly logging its thousands of small signals, the alert stays green, and the debate over what that green actually means keeps running right alongside it. Zooming back out to the bigger picture, it's worth remembering that Tenerife isn't operating in isolation here. The Canary Islands as a whole sit on a volcanic hotspot chain, and other islands in the archipelago have their own monitoring programs watching for exactly these same DS of hybrid and long-period signals. What happened on La Palma in 2021 didn't just change how residents on that island think about risk, it changed how every monitoring agency across the Canaries communicates uncertainty to the public. Vulcan and the IGN have both, in the years since, moved toward publishing more raw data more quickly, precisely because the lesson coming out of La Palma was that opacity, even unintentional opacity, born from the normal pace of scientific verification, erodes public trust faster than releasing preliminary, uncertain numbers ever could. That shift is part of why residents on Tenerife are even in a position to see automatic counts in the thousands right now in the first place. A decade ago, that same raw data likely wouldn't have been public at all until after manual review was complete, which means some of the current anxiety is, ironically, a direct side effect of the same transparency reforms that were meant to fix the exact trust problem residents are now expressing frustration over. That's not a criticism of the reforms. More data getting to the public faster is, on balance, a good thing, and it's far better than the alternative most residents actually fear, being kept in the dark. But it does mean the burden of interpretation has shifted meaningfully onto residents and journalists themselves, who now have to make sense of technical categories like hybrid events, volcano-tectonic swarms, and long-period signals without always having a scientist standing next to them translating what a given number is and doesn't mean in the moment. That's precisely the gap this kind of reporting is trying to close, translating the raw instrument readings into a clear, honest picture of what's actually known, what remains uncertain, and what would need to change before the situation genuinely escalates. For now, the picture beneath Tenerife hasn't changed in any way that meets the threshold monitoring agencies have set for raising the alert level. The swarm is large, it's persistent, and it's part of a pattern that is now stretched on for the better part of a decade without producing an eruption. Scientists are watching closely, eatings and ground deformation are being tracked in real time, and the specific combination of signals that has historically preceded genuine eruptions elsewhere in the world simply isn't present in the current data. That's the honest state of play right now, and it's likely to remain the honest state of play for some time yet, unless something in that underlying pattern actually shifts.